Between the 1950s and 60s, America had a serious problem. On top of the ongoing nuclear arms race during the Cold War, there was a new threat. The Soviets had built a superjet, one that was bigger, faster, stronger, and more maneuverable than any jet we had ever seen. We were terrified of this weapon. This unbeatable war machine was a threat and the dominant power of the skies, until a Soviet defector brought us a jet and we were able to examine it. It was at that time that we learned that we had been afraid of a flying I-beam the entire time. Hello everyone, and welcome to Hider Thoughts. And today, I'm thinking about some Cold War era aircraft. We're going to take a small detour this week on our cryptid road trip and talk about something that has always fascinated me and made me giggle at the same time. There are a lot of cool stories and a lot of interesting history that happened around the Cold War. And one of the things that's always interested me is the aircraft that came out during this time, because we did a lot of things that we had never done before, like building the fastest jet alive, the SR-71 Blackbird, the first successful vertical liftoff and takeoff jet, that being the Harrier, and we even built jets that were so powerful that they could fly with their wings folded up in the storage position, just because the engines were strong enough to propel them forward and take them in the air to continue their missions. There's so much cool aeronautic engineering that took place during this time that you could make hours of videos just focusing on that topic specifically. But we're only going to focus on a few examples today, many of them revolving around knee-jerk responses to photos or propaganda that was pushed by one side or the other. So with that, we're going to jump right into it. But as always, thank you for watching. Before we get into the main topic, we're going to give a little bit of background as to what was going on during this time of history. So the Cold War started almost immediately after the Allies won World War II, and Russia and the United States developed a rivalry that continued until the Soviet Union fell in 1991. This rivalry had many aspects and was referred to as the Cold War. The Cold War was not a traditional war in the sense that the sides were fighting each other and blowing each other up, but rather it was a war on many fronts. It was a war of ideas, with the West wanting to continue democracy and their principles and freedoms, while being concerned that the Russians were going to take over all of Eastern Europe and spread communism as far as wide as they could. And the Russians wanted to secure the eastern part of Europe to prevent Germany from rising for a third time and attacking them again. And they also wanted to spread communism from an idealistic perspective, thinking that it was the best ideology to run a country in general. The war peaked in 1949 with the successful annexation of East Berlin from the West. NATO also formed, and communists took control of China. But the big defining moment was the USSR broke the United States monopoly on nuclear weapons. With Russia developing nuclear weapons, the Cold War was now also a war of an arms race, where both sides were stockpiling weapons and trying to find bigger, faster, and more secure ways to deliver the payload to the opposing forces. The delivery methods began to ramp up with development of longer-range bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles, which had not been used before. With the size and the number of nukes increasing, the various governments needed new ways to deliver these apparatuses. Thus began a bomber race, where both sides were trying to build as many bombers as they could. The president of the US at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the general that led the invasion of D-Day, and overall probably one of my favorite presidents of all time, maybe make a video about him some other time, but he adopted a new policy called the New Look, where he would pull resources away from the traditional Navy and Army forces to focus more on the Air Force and nuclear capabilities. He did this for a couple reasons. One was to focus more on what was needed at the time, which was air power and nuclear weapons, but the other part was he needed to invest in those new technologies without straining the economy to focus on a growing sector of what the military needed. While controversial, with many Army and Navy personnel demanding the same amount or more money to keep growing their fleets instead of an air fleet, this policy helped the United States when the bomber gap was discovered. The bomber gap was discovered in 1954, and I say discovered because it wasn't a real thing, but rather a perceived inferiority of the United States relative to the Soviet Union's air power. In July of 1954, the Soviet Union flew 28 of their brand new jet bombers, the Myasishchev, you're welcome, M4 Bisons over the Red Square, shocking American intelligence that the Russians had built such a jet faster than we thought they could and larger. it was able to fly from Russia to the United States and back to Russia after dropping off its payload. At the rate that the Russians had produced those 28 jets, it was projected that in 5 years they would have a fleet of 800 of these bombers. Eisenhower doubted that there was a bomber gap. In fact, he believed that the Russians did not have the ability to produce bombers at that rate, and he thought that there might be some trickery going on. But with so much public pressure and no proof to the contrary, he was forced to focus on developing new spy planes and increasing the United States bomber fleet. That included building 800 B-52s and a bunch of U-2 spy planes in order to fly to Russia and confirm what they had. And it turned out Eisenhower was right. The Russians had built a jet bomber, but they only had 10 at the time of the Red Square Parade, not 28. What they did was they had the bombers fly in over, and it's massive planes. So you see these 10 beautiful beast of aircraft fly over, and as soon as they were out of sight of everybody, they circled all the way back around and then did another loop, and they did that 3 times to make it look like they had a massive air fleet, when in reality they had 10 of these bombers, and I think they still only had 10 by the time we got a U-2 plane over there to spy on them. But by the time that we had confirmed that there was a low number of these bombers with the U-2, it was kind of already too late. We had amassed over 2,500 brand new bombers. We also learned that the M4 that the Russians built was unable to fly to the US and back, meaning it would be a one-way trip if they launched those bombers to come to the US, because there was nowhere for them to land or refuel on the way to the mainland United States. This is the first example in our video today where we're going to see the military gets a picture or a snapshot of something, and it's going to end up being not 100% what we thought, but off that information we way overreacted. Flipping to the Soviet side, they thought that we had developed a fleet of supersonic bombers, the XB-70. These planes were able to fly across the ocean, drop their payload, and come back before the Russians had time to scramble any interceptors or missiles to try to stop these planes from happening. But you notice when I said the name of that plane, I called it the XB-70. That's because it was a prototype plane. It never entered actual service, and we only had 2 of them. But the Russians didn't know that. They thought they had an entire fleet, so they built the MiG-25 as a response. So the MiG-25 was built in mind to chase down and destroy supersonic bombers. And when we got pictures of the thing, we thought it was the best fighter jet on the planet. Our SR-71 Blackbirds had flown over and taken pictures of these things, and based on the way the plane was shaped and designed and where its wings were placed, it looked a lot like it was just as maneuverable, if not more maneuverable, than our F-4 Phantoms, which was our air superiority fighter at the time. We had also clocked one of these things flying, and it was going Mach 3.2, which horrified the US because the fastest jet we had, the SR-71 Blackbird, had a top speed of Mach 3.4, meaning that these things had the possibility of chasing down our supersonic aircraft. The threat of this jet gripped the West because it meant Russia not only had a fighter that was better than any aircraft we had, but it also meant that they had the ability to play defense and prevent nuclear retaliation on them should they decide to attack us first. That fear, though, pushed us into developing our own air superiority fighter, one that would actually reign dominant for over 30 or 40 years, I think, once we had it built. But before these 2 planes ever had to interact with each other, we got lucky because a Soviet defector brought a jet to us, and we learned that we had been afraid of a flying anvil the entire time. On September 6, 1976, during a training flight involving several MiG-25s, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko broke off from his squad, heading towards Japan. His intent was to defect to the United States. Victor flew to Japan looking for a military base to land at. Unfortunately, due to inclement weather, he could not find one, and the first airfield he found was actually a civilian airport. He circled this airport 3 times, waiting for an opportunity to come down and land, and when he finally did, he almost crashed into a civilian 727. The landing of a Soviet jet was shocking to most, and a bunch of civilians and airport personnel ran over to the jet to take pictures of it and to try to figure out what it had done landing at a civilian airport. This caused Victor to exit his plane and fire his pistol into the air, trying to keep the crowd away from his jet and make sure he was safe. The airbase then called the military saying, "Hey, the Soviet jet just landed in our airport, what do we do?" And the military said, "Oh, just call the police." because, that's what I do when I see Soviet jets landing in my street. I call the police. I don't call the Air Force. Anyway, so the police come and they arrest Blanco, rightfully so, but for violating Japanese airspace and for discharging a weapon in public. Those were the two charges that he got. Once he was arrested, he specifically requested asylum from the United States, stating that he wanted to defect from the Soviet Union. And the Soviets were not happy. They were not happy at all. They immediately requested the return of their pilot and their jet back to them. And Japan initially refused, saying, oh, he's an asylum seeker, and don't worry, we'll get the jet back to you soon. In response, the Russians started to capture Japanese fishermen and impound their boats. Most say it was for retaliation, but the Russians claim it was because they were violating international waters, which, yeah, no, it was retaliation. So eventually the plane was returned to the Soviets, but that was after US and Japanese forces had taken the entire plane apart to analyze it and learn what made it tick. The really funny thing about that is when they sent the plane back, they sent it back in pieces, and the Russians claimed that it was missing 18 pieces. So in disassembling the MiG-25, we learned a lot about it, and this is actually where I have a personal connection to this aircraft, because my uncle was on base when they were disassembling it, and he told a story about there was one of the engineers who was schematic and writing everything down and seeing what was what. He was walking around with a magnet and he kept touching it to different parts of the jet and watching it stick and going, how the hell is this also steel? Just tink. Okay, moved over to the next part. Tink, like the whole jet, the entire thing was steel, which made no sense because it was so unbelievably heavy. And there was a specific reason for that. The Russians had built this jet with the single purpose in mind of chasing down and intercepting a supersonic bomber. So when we clocked it at Mach 3.2, which was its maximum speed, that was the truth. But this jet could only do that once. That jet's normal operating speed was Mach 2.6. Flying at Mach 3.2 burned the engines out and made the jet unable to take off again. So if they did that, it was a one shot and they were done. The features that we thought were for agility and mobility, namely the way the wings were shaped and the overall structure of the plane, that was actually there to keep the plane from falling apart when it was flying that fast. And it was built out of steel so that it could support that speed and the temperatures when it was going that quickly. In hindsight, it's funny that we were so afraid of this jet when it was really a one-trick pony. And it did lead to the United States developing what I think is one of the best jets ever, the F-15 Eagle, and there's no particular reason for that. The F-15 was built to be the top fighter. It was designed to take down what we thought was a highly maneuverable, supersonic jet that was almost impossible for anything else we had at the time to take down. Fortunately for us, that wasn't true. But we built a jet as if it were true. So the F-15, once it was done, was able to win hundreds of air victories and never losing. It dominated the skies from its launch until it was eventually replaced in the early 2000s by the F-22 Raptor, which I think is still the big dog and the scariest aircraft known to man today. So on top of building the F-15, which became the world's most powerful fighter for a very long time, we also ran our own propaganda against the Russians. And I'm throwing this in because we talked about their propaganda of flying the same bombers over and over to make it look like they had a bunch more, and it made us panic and way overreact to that. But here's one we did to kind of intimidate them, to deter them from attacking us. So during, I think it was the Nixon administration, we had a program called the Star Wars program, and part of that was developing laser weapons that could shoot down the ICBMs. We, of course, didn't actually have any of these laser weapons, but we acted like we did. We even did a test once where we brought a bunch of people, I think reporters, into a showroom where there was a giant piece of steel, solid steel there, and we said, okay, everybody out, and we shut all the doors, and then we fired a laser, and while that laser was firing, what was actually happening was a bunch of guys went into that room, picked up the good steel, ran it out, and then pulled in a new piece of steel with a giant hole in it, and then they left the room and let everyone come back into the room and see that, oh yeah, we've got a laser. Look what it just did, guys. This is 100% true. We're not lying, I promise you. You know, the Cold War was just such a crazy time. On top of the threat of nuclear annihilation that was going on, there was a lot of cool things, technology-wise, and other espionage stories or just fascinating military stories that were going on at the same time. But for this video, I really wanted to focus on the aeronautic arms race that was going on, largely because I think the story of the MiG-25 is really interesting, and that my uncle actually got to see the defected jet and touch it. That's just such a cool piece of history that, you know, you always say you're 4 people removed away from somebody. Well, I guess my uncle, if I'm going direct to my uncle, I'm 2 people away from a defected Soviet pilot, which is just really cool to think about. As technology has advanced, I like to think that with better surveillance and satellite photos, we're not going to make the same mistakes that we used to in the past, where we fly over something, take pictures, and assume a bunch of stuff based on just these pictures. I know that satellites probably can do videos, so we can get actual footage of what these things are. So if we had that back then, we could have seen the MiG flying and going, oh, this thing can only go in a straight line. It can't maneuver at all. Not that big of a threat, but you know, we did what we had to do back then with the technology that we had. I'm excited to see in the future, like in the next 30 years, what intelligence we were working off of when we built like the F-22, to see, oh gosh, what do we need the F-22 to take care of, when in reality it was something that wasn't even close. And maybe that's why we scaled back the F-22 and started focusing on the F-35, which is a smaller and lighter aircraft, but still very effective nonetheless. And that does it for this week, guys. I really appreciate all of you who stayed with me through this video. I know it was a little different than the other ones we've done, but I had a lot of fun and I hope you did too. I appreciate each and every one of you, and thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Later.